Real estate investing is amazing, but it doesn't mean that it's without risk. As an investor, one of the worst things that you can find is that you are in the middle of an eviction where your tenant is not paying and not leaving, and you are losing on the rent while still paying the mortgage and having to pay for the costly process of having them evicted, going through the legal system and hoping that they didn't trash your house. At the same time, tenants don't win during an eviction either. They have to find a new place to go. They often can't find a way to get all their stuff out of your house and into another one, and everybody loses. In today's episode, Christian Batchelder and I are going to get into how you avoid evictions, which areas have a smoother eviction process, and strategies that you can use to build wealth through real estate while mitigating the risk of eviction. All that and more on today's episode of Mortgage Monday.
But before we get into the show, I want to thank the sponsor for today's episode, Avail. With Avail, you can landlord like a pro. Peak rental season is around the corner, and the time to market your units to fill them is quickly approaching. Avail is the perfect tool to help you do just that, increasing your chances of finding tenants by getting your property in front of millions of renters on the top rental websites. Have your prospects apply online so you can screen them with trustworthy reports, then sign your lease and start collecting rent online while letting your tenants choose how they pay. Go to avail.co now and get ahead of the busy season. That's avail.co. Now, back to Mortgage Mondays.
Christian Batchelder, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you, David Green.
I'm coming to you from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I'm recording in an upstairs attic. Christian's coming to you from Los Angeles, California, where he is in his swanky apartment complex. And BiggerPockets is coming to you from all over the country, which is the topic of today's episode. We're going to be talking about long-distance real estate investing, and in particular, how landlord or tenant-friendly laws should affect your investing. Now, I cover this a little bit in my book. You can find it at biggerpockets.com/long distance book. But on the BiggerPockets blog, there's actually a article that's trending right now that talks about this a lot more. It's a 5-minute read. I highly recommend everybody go check it out. It's titled, How Much Should a State's Landlord-Tenant Law Affect Your Real Estate Investing Strategy? Now, if you don't want to read because you're already listening, guess what? You're going to get the Cliff Notes, and we're getting into it today. So, Christian, when it comes to long-distance real estate investing, are you a fan, or do you only invest in Los Angeles?
It's funny. I don't invest in Los Angeles. I don't even own where I live. I pay rent in LA and I invest in other states. I may be in the minority there, so kind of funny way to do things. But I have chosen, exactly like how we're going to talk about today, to invest in areas that are historically more friendly towards the landlord, towards the property owner. I invest on the Southeast Coast, namely Tennessee, the Carolinas, and Florida.
Yes. Now, this article talks about how with the information age exploding, there are more resources than ever for tenants to get what they refer to as legal aid, but really it's ways that tenants can work the system. When it comes to an eviction, that is different than a tenant just not paying rent. An eviction typically refers to when a tenant breaks the terms of the lease, but that almost always happens through the non-payment of rent and then decides not to leave the property once you've asked them to do so. This is not the same as a tenant that just fell upon hard times and couldn't pay their rent. This is a tenant who didn't pay their rent and then chose not to leave, getting the landlord to forcefully evict them through the legal system. Now, obviously, the idea is to avoid ever being in that situation, but occasionally it's going to happen. What are your thoughts, Christian, on only investing in areas where the laws favor the landlord compared to the tenant for when these situations occur?
I definitely think it's something that needs to come into consideration, right, during your underwriting and building your buy box, right, is what we typically refer to it as. It needs to be a consideration. I don't think it should be the sole contributor. Obviously, if you have a lower threshold to risk, if you're maximizing your leverage on a property, having a 80% investment property loan at a higher than average interest rate, not having a whole lot of savings in the bank, getting a mortgage that, you got to work a little bit to make sure it gets paid. That can put you in a position where you need to depend on that rental income, right? You need that rental income, right? If you don't have it, you really start to get strained financially. And if you're in that position, would I recommend investing in a more landlord-friendly state? Yes, absolutely, because that's going to lower the threshold of what may, I wouldn't say ruin you financially, but significantly burden you financially. Whereas if you did that in California, tenant may be there for 6 months during an eviction, right? And are you financially capable of extending 6 months of your mortgage without that rent coming in? That could be tricky.
There's no exception to mortgages where if the tenant doesn't pay you, you don't have to pay the lender. They're not, oh, we understand totally. You don't have the money to pay us. Just, get back to us when you can. Like the tenants are always asking from the landlord. So you have to realize when you're the one that owns the property, you're going to have pressure from below, meaning the tenant needs to pay you the rent. Then you're going to have pressure from above, meaning the lender is still asking you for the payment and you can get stuck in the pressure sandwich. So any advice there for how landlords should be prepared to survive that pressure sandwich?
Yeah, I just think of like during COVID when rent abatements started happening, right? Government was just saying you don't have to pay your rent. Now the response to that was a lot of mortgages also got forbeared, right? So the lenders realized that, oh man, if we make these landlords pay us and tenants aren't paying them, that sandwich, right, is starting to happen. Just in terms of a normal process though, I know we're going to get into this more so, David, but the biggest way to overcome this is just good tenant underwriting. Are you reviewing applications? Are you asking the right questions? Are you maybe using a third-party screening company? Are you letting somebody that has a prior eviction on their record rent from you, checking credit scores, all the things that typically, I mean, if any of you listening have ever filled out a lease application, you know what the landlords typically ask, right? It's quite a bit. It's almost like a mortgage application at some point, right? If you're vetting and pre-qualifying those people effectively, you're going to reduce your risk of potentially renting to somebody who is going to end up needing an eviction.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Christian, and that's because I'm jealous that you still have a beautiful head of hair and I don't. So I'm going to put a little bit of that pressure on you out of pure spite and jealousy. It is true that investing in an area where the laws favor you as a landlord can be wise, but often these are the areas with less appreciation. You get less rent increases and you get less value increases. And when you invest in an area that is not appreciating, if you make a mistake, you can get stuck and it can be very hard to get out of it. Versus an area where you experience appreciation, if you make that same mistake, that will be made up for in a couple years of price increases and you can sell the house to somebody else, or the rent increases will cover over the mistakes that you made. You really have a much smaller margin of error when you're investing in some of these areas that are more landlord friendly. You're also missing out on the upside that comes from big growth. How do you think investors need to balance this?
I don't want this to get conflated because I can already see everybody in the forums. Of course, they're going to say that there's no bad place to buy real estate. You can buy equity. I'm not saying that, guys. However, this is the basis of why we say the industry, there are opportunities in every market. Real estate is very location specific. I think of your personal portfolio, David, and I think you've made more money on appreciation on just your California properties than cash flow on your entire portfolio in the last 10 years. I would probably put my money on that, right? Just what those, whatever it is, 6, 7, 8, I forget how many you have in California, but just what those properties have appreciated is significant. I mean, it's massive, right? It's a huge equity gain that you've realized net worth wise. Now, when you look at that compared to the $100 a month cash flowing property that's in a landlord friendly state, you do start to see the discrepancy there and say, ooh, there's a huge loss there that I'm realizing if you only considered landlord friendly laws as your sole contributor of where to invest, which is why I said this should be a contributor, but not the sole reason why you invest in that area, right? You need to take the whole thing into account. Do you have the capability, like I shared, of covering your mortgage in the event of an eviction? It goes both ways. It should be a contributor. If you have the net worth, the income, the financial stability to cover that mortgage payment in the event of an eviction, awesome. Make your investments with the risk that you're willing to take on.
All right. Now, one way that you can avoid evictions is by investing in short-term rentals. Now, that doesn't mean you can't end up with an eviction, but it's much less likely to happen. Typically, when people get evicted, it's from their home. They have all their stuff there. They don't want to leave. You don't get as many tenants that move into a short-term rental and try to make it their home within 30 days. So while short-term rentals can pose more risk in certain ways, you have less stability, you have more fluctuation, they can pose less risk in this realm. So what are your thoughts on if you're going to be investing in areas that have, let's say, stronger landlord-friendly laws and processes, but you really like that upside, investing in short-term rentals instead of long-term rentals to kind of mitigate the risk of the eviction?
I love it. I mean, you guys don't need to know what I do, but if you are interested, I am an Airbnb investor. I own multiple across the southeastern coast of the United States. I have chosen those markets specifically because this as a fact of my underwriting, right? Not the sole contributor, once again, but something that I absolutely considered because same thing. If David said it's more rare, that's correct. But if somebody did choose to overextend their stay in one of my Airbnbs, I wanted there to be an easy and straightforward way of remedying the problem. And on the topic of short-term rentals, maybe even more important than landlord laws, kind of pivots the conversation into what is the ordinance specifically regarding short-term rentals. So this is kind of the short-term rental version of the eviction and tenant landlord laws and who governs it. Is it your state? Is it your county? Is it your city? There's different levels of government depending on where you are. And having knowledge of that, and once again, taking that into account in your underwriting, should absolutely be a feature of when you are looking for an area of where to invest.
Yeah, now let me complicate this even more so because the people listening love this information. The laws are not only concerning evictions. There's also situations like the one I found myself in Florida, where the local municipality has stepped in and shut down the properties that I bought because I applied for a short-term rental license. And they said, oh, we don't want short-term rentals, but we're not allowed to tell you no. It's actually a landlord-friendly state. But the local cities said, well, in 1954, the previous owner added a bathroom to this place and didn't get permits. So we are going to make you tear out that bathroom. We're going to make you tear out the kitchen remodel that was done before you bought it. This addition to the house, this ADU in the backyard, this duplex that's on the property, this garage that was converted from a carport to a garage that actually made the house worth more and the neighborhood worth more. You need to tear all of that out because they don't want short-term rental operators. So even in a situation that's very landlord friendly, I still got myself in trouble with local city municipalities that became creative with how they apply the law. Now, I understand you found an article dealing with Florida specifically and how they're rearranging. Can you share what you found in that article and how Florida is trying to combat this?
Absolutely. Once again, guys, working with people, whether it's your property manager, your agent, your loan officer that has knowledge about specific markets, this is some of the advantages they can bring. We have a client who's investing in short-term rental in Florida, and there's a new ordinance that potentially is going to go into effect. This is now a bill that has been presented to the state legislature. Apparently, both sides of the government like it, and it is being sent to Ron DeSantis. Those unaware, maybe you don't watch the news. That is the governor of Florida, right? He ultimately signs off on state legislature, and he has said he would sign this. And this new bill basically converts all of the ordinance and denials and approvals of short-term rentals, takes it away from the local jurisdictions, which is city and county, and takes it back to the state level. And being a landlord-friendly state, Ron DeSantis has said Airbnbs and short-term rentals brought in a massive amount of tax revenue to the state. Now, remember, Florida is an income tax-free state, so they got to make taxes somewhere. This is something that you can think of when you're starting to buy. You're probably going to make up that tax somewhere else if there's no income tax, right? Similar to Texas, if any of you are familiar with how high their property taxes have gotten. Right. But in Florida, basically, Ron DeSantis is saying, I want to protect Airbnbs within reason. I don't want every house on every block to be an Airbnb, but within reason up to a certain capacity. But I want it to be state run. I don't want each individual city and county to start convoluting the process and saying you can here, but you go one block over and you can't here. That doesn't really make sense. Right. So he's basically creating a new branch of the Florida state government that is going to oversee, if this goes through, oversee short-term rentals. Vacation rentals is what Florida technically calls them. And they will remove the allowances for city or county to approve or deny short-term rental permits, which, to summarize all this up, is a good thing for Airbnb investors. But if you're a buyer looking to occupy there and you don't want Airbnbs and party house, a lot of local people who own properties don't like them. That's something that you want to consider in your underwriting if you're buying a primary residence. So it helps one side of investors, may hurt one side of the other, which is why do your research, make sure you're underwriting this, and make the decision that you feel best aligns with your risk and reward thresholds.
Yeah, now I bring this up because it's too simple to say, well, are the eviction laws landlord or tenant friendly? And that's all you got to think about. Because there's several levels of government, like we just said, and they have different political agendas. So at the local level, these cities don't want Airbnbs and short-term rentals and vacation rentals in their neighborhoods, but the state has said they're allowed to have them. We want it because it makes revenue for the state, but not as much of that revenue goes to the city. The cities are listening to their constituents, which are people in those neighborhoods that are writing letters and complaining, saying, hey, we don't want these here. So even if you invest in a landlord-friendly area, you can still find yourself in trouble like this. Now, my best advice for how you avoid trouble overall is that you invest in an area where you can be picky about your tenant. If you're investing in an area where not many tenants are applying and you don't have a whole lot of applications, so you have to just take whatever you get, it's going to be tougher to avoid choosing a tenant that doesn't want to be evicted. You want to choose tenants that don't want to be evicted. So my advice to investors is choose tenants that have something to lose, which means invest in areas where these tenants want to live, get as many tenants as you can, and have the strongest tenant pool to pick from. Just like when you have a listing, you're trying to get multiple offers and you're picking the strongest buyer and the one that wants wants it the most. I think that principle should apply to investing in real estate as well. As an example, my California properties that I own, which is a very tenant-friendly state, I've owned since 2009 when I bought the first one. I have 6 properties there. I've had 1 eviction in the entire time that I've owned them. 6 properties over, what is that, like 14 years.
And some of those are multifamilies, I believe, right, David? So it's not just 6 tenants. That's a number of them.
But the people that I'm renting to don't want an eviction on their record. If they can't pay the rent, they just leave, and I let them leave. And as long as they didn't trash the house, I let the next tenant in and I don't worry about it. That's because I've invested in areas where you get growth. And my point here is that when you can be picky about your tenant, it doesn't matter if the laws favor you or don't favor you. It matters to a degree, but it doesn't come up as often. If you're investing in areas because they're landlord friendly, but you can't be picky about the tenant that you choose, you're going to be utilizing those laws a lot. And that's not something that you want to say is a strength of your portfolio, that you're really good at evictions.
You know, we can kind of make a slogan out of the good landlord doesn't have to evict, right? That means they're doing good due diligence up front, reviewing their tenant applications. They're making sure they're picking somebody who, just like David said, has something to lose. I mean, it's the same underwriting that we do as lending. When you go get a mortgage, man, the lender is really making sure that not only do you have the ability to repay, but you got something to lose. You have equity in that property, or you have net worth outside of that property. And really, landlords are doing just a more efficient version of that, right? They're checking to make sure that tenant is in the higher bracket of likeliness to pay that rent.
That's right. Now, if you want to check out this article or other articles like it, head over to the BiggerPockets blog. As mentioned, this one is called "How Much Should a State's Landlord-Tenant Laws Affect Your Real Estate Investing Strategy?" But there's a lot of other really good stuff on the BiggerPockets blog. And as a little known fact, before I ever wrote a book for BiggerPockets Publishing, I was one of the blog authors. So you can go back there and you can search my name and you can actually read some of the initial stuff that I was writing when I was a newer investor getting started in California and just getting into long distance real estate investing. Myself at the time, it was this uphill battle to convince people that they can invest in other states or that they should be investing at all. Now, people pretty much just expect that they can invest anywhere. And that's why we have conversations like this to help relay the strengths and weaknesses of different markets and the strategies that will work better. So go check those out. And as you're listening to this on BiggerPockets YouTube, make sure that you give us a like and you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notified when new episodes come out, which are typically every Monday, but occasionally Christian and I put out a bonus episode for you. And leave us a comment about what you thought about today's show. Do you think that investors need to put more energy or less energy into choosing a market based on the laws affecting evictions, or do you think there's other metrics that are more important to look at? If you've got a second, check out another BiggerPockets video, and if not, we will see you next week on Mortgage Mondays.